The sun was slowly rising above the wide plains when Eli James pushed open the wooden door of his small ranch house. The morning air was cool and the sky was soft pink. The ranch stood at the far edge of town, where the grass grew long and the wind always seemed to carry a song. Eli was a quiet man. He had lived alone for many years, working the land that had once belonged to his father. His boots were old, his hat dusty, but his hands were steady and strong. Every day began the same way. He would feed the horse, check the fence line, and walk past the herd of cattle that grazed near the creek. The herd was small, just enough to keep him alive and give him a few coins at the end of each season. Eli never complained. He wasn't the kind of man who wasted words. People in town said he was the quiet cowboy with calloused hands, and they were right. He had seen hard winters, storms, and loneliness, but he kept going with calm determination. Inside the house, everything was simple. A wooden table, a single bed, a stove where he boiled coffee and cooked beans. His life was plain, but he had made peace with it. Still, somewhere deep inside him, there was a quiet wish he never said out loud. He wanted someone to come home to, someone who would sit with him in the evening, listen to the wind with him, and share this land that he had worked so hard to build. That morning, he saddled his horse and started riding toward town. It was a dusty ride, about an hour long. The main street of the small frontier town was already waking up. The blacksmith was hammering iron. A few children ran past the well. Traders were setting up tables outside the general store. Eli didn't often come into town unless it was for supplies. He didn't like the loud talk, the rough laughter, or the curious eyes that always followed him. But today he needed flour, salt, and nails for mending the fence. As he tied his horse outside the trading post, he noticed something unusual. A group of men stood together near the porch, talking in low, serious voices. Among them was Mr. Clark, the owner of the trading post, a man known for dealing with both settlers and local Apache tribes. Eli nodded to him and stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots. The air inside smelled of coffee, tobacco, and dried leather. But more than the smell, it was the sound that caught Eli's attention. People were whispering. Something was happening. At the far counter, Mr. Clark was speaking to a tall, older man wrapped in a worn blanket, an Apache elder. His face was weathered, but his eyes were steady. Beside him stood a young man who translated his words into English. Eli stood quietly near the shelf of flour sacks, pretending to look at prices, but his ears caught every word. Mr. Clark explained to a small crowd of curious settlers that the Apache tribe had suffered badly during the last winter. Several families were gone, and 2 young women, sisters, were left with no family to care for them. The tribe wanted to find a safe place for them. Not a business deal, not a cold trade. They wanted someone who could give them food, protection, and a home. One of the men in the room scoffed and asked, "How much are they asking for?" The translator repeated the question to the elder, who shook his head. Mr. Clark replied, "They are not asking for gold or horses. They want something simple, a token of promise. Enough to show this man will keep them safe." The room grew quieter. No one laughed now. This wasn't an auction. This was a serious, almost sacred moment. The sisters, Alona and Nita, were standing outside, their faces hidden under soft shawls. They were young, but they had already seen more hardship than most could imagine. Eli's heart beat a little faster, though he didn't know why. He hadn't planned to be part of anything like this. He came for flour and nails, not for life-changing choices. Yet as he stood there, something stirred inside him. He looked down at his worn gloves and thought of his empty house. He thought of the long, quiet nights and the soft wish he always carried in silence. Mr. Clark spoke again. "The tribe only asks for a promise. A small offering. Something to show your word is true. $12 is enough to show you are serious. But remember, this is not a trade. If you take this responsibility, you take it for life. $12. Eli had exactly $12 left in a leather pouch under his belt. That money was supposed to buy enough supplies to last through the summer. He closed his hand around the pouch. The crowd waited. A few men looked down. No one stepped forward. Eli walked to the counter slowly. His boots echoed in the quiet room. He didn't say anything dramatic. He didn't make promises with flowery words. He just pulled the leather pouch from his belt, untied the string, and placed the $12 on the worn wooden counter. The coins made a soft clinking sound that filled the room. Mr. Clark looked at him with raised brows. "Eli," he said carefully, "are you sure about this?" Eli simply nodded. "I'll take care of them," he said in his calm, steady voice. That was all. The elder studied Eli's face for a long moment. Then he nodded too, slow and respectful. The translator spoke a few quiet words, and the elder replied in his native tongue. Mr. Clark explained to the room, "They accept. The sisters will go with him." For a brief second, everything went silent. The other men in the room exchanged surprised looks. Some thought he was foolish to give away all his money. Others quietly admired the courage of a man who made such a promise without hesitation. Outside, the sisters stood near the porch, watching everything through the shade of their shawls. Alona, the older sister, stood straight and calm. Nita, younger and nervous, held on to the edge of her shawl. They didn't understand everything that was being said inside, but they understood the moment. Someone had stepped forward for them. Someone had said yes. Eli stepped out onto the porch and looked at them for the first time. The wind was blowing gently, lifting dust from the road. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. He didn't know their language, and they didn't know his. But he saw something in Alona's steady gaze, quiet strength. In Nita's shy eyes, he saw fear mixed with hope. He didn't speak. He just touched the brim of his hat in a polite greeting. Alona gave a small nod in return. The people in town would remember that moment for a long time, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was quiet and real. A man with nothing but honesty in his heart gave up his last $12 to give two young women a safe place to live. Later that afternoon, as Eli rode home on his horse, the sun was high and warm. Behind him, a wagon followed, carrying Alona and Nita with their few belongings. Eli didn't look back. He rode forward, feeling something unfamiliar stirring inside him. His ranch would no longer be silent. He didn't know what the future would bring. He didn't know how they would learn to live together, or what storms would come. But he knew one thing for sure. This was the day everything changed. And all it took was $12, a quiet promise, and the courage to say yes. The wind carried the sound of the wagon wheels as the wide plains stretched before them. The sun glowed gold on the horizon. For the first time in years, Eli felt like he wasn't riding toward an empty house. He was riding toward something that might one day be called home. The next morning, the town woke slowly, as it always did. But for Eli, everything felt different. He was standing on the same dusty porch outside the trading post, the same wind brushing against his old hat. But something inside him had shifted. Just yesterday, he was a man who lived alone with his cattle and his horse. Today, two young women were depending on him to give them a home. The wagon stood in front of the trading post, ready for the long ride back to his ranch. The sisters were sitting side by side on the wooden seat at the back. Alona sat tall, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth, her expression calm and unreadable. Nita, the younger one, kept glancing around nervously, as if every sound and movement in this unfamiliar town made her heart beat faster. Their shawls covered their hair, and their hands stayed folded neatly in their laps. Eli walked slowly toward the wagon. He wasn't sure how to speak to them. Words didn't come easy for him, not even in English, let alone in a language he didn't know. But when he reached the wagon, he gave them a small nod, a simple gesture that said, "I'm not here to harm you." Alona returned the nod quietly. Nita lowered her eyes but didn't step away. That small moment gave him a bit of courage. The townfolk stood at a distance, watching. Some whispered to each other. Some shook their heads. Others simply looked curious. They had seen all kinds of things in this frontier town. Cattle drives, gunfights, runaway wagons, gold prospectors, even droughts. But they had never seen a quiet cowboy walk into town with $12 and walk out with two Apache women under his care. Mr. Clark came out of the trading post with a folded paper in his hand. "Here, Eli," he said. "Just something to make the arrangement clear. It's not a contract, it's a promise. Everyone knows your word is good." Eli took the paper and nodded, then folded it carefully and put it inside his coat pocket. The wagon creaked as he climbed into the driver's seat. He picked up the reins and gave a gentle click of his tongue. The horse began to move slowly down the dirt road. The sound of the wheels turning on the dry ground was steady and calm. For a while, no one spoke. Only the wind, the horse's hooves, and the creaking wheels filled the silence. Alona sat just behind him. Even without turning around, Eli could sense her quiet strength. She wasn't frightened like her younger sister. She watched everything: the trees, the road, the people they passed. She seemed like someone who carried many memories on her shoulders. Nita kept glancing at her, taking comfort in her sister's calmness. The ride to the ranch was long and dusty. The sun climbed higher, warming their backs. The road stretched endlessly with open plains on both sides. A hawk circled in the sky. Occasionally, Eli looked over his shoulder to make sure they were comfortable. They didn't speak, but Alona's eyes met his once, and she gave a very small nod, the kind of nod that meant we're fine. Hours later, they reached the edge of Eli's land. It wasn't a grand ranch. It was just a small piece of open plain with a narrow creek, a wooden fence, a weathered barn, and a one-room cabin with smoke rising from the chimney. To most people, it was a quiet place. But to Eli, it was everything. It was the land his father had built with his own hands and the only place he truly called home. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the cabin. Eli climbed down first. The sisters stepped down slowly, their feet touching the dry earth for the first time. Alona looked around carefully, studying the barn, the corral, and the open field. Nita stood close to her, half hiding behind her shoulder. Eli opened the cabin door and stepped aside, silently inviting them in. Inside, the cabin was simple. A wooden table, a few chairs, one bed, a small stove, and shelves with neatly stacked supplies. Eli had never imagined sharing this space with anyone. It wasn't built for 3 people. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, safe, and honest. Alona stepped inside first, moving with quiet grace. Nita followed slowly, touching the doorframe as if testing if it was real. Their eyes moved over every corner, taking in the plain but steady life of the man who now shared his roof with them. Eli stood by the door, feeling a strange mix of nervousness and calm. He had invited them in, but he had no idea what to say next. Eli cleared his throat. "This is home," he said softly. He wasn't sure if they understood his words, but tone sometimes speaks louder than language. Alona looked at him, then at the small cabin, then back at him. She gave a single, gentle nod. Nita copied her a second later. Eli walked to the barn to let them settle. He needed time to breathe and gather his thoughts. He leaned against the wooden wall outside, looking at the fields. $12. That was all it had taken to bring them here. But the weight of that choice felt much bigger. He had promised them safety. He had promised to take care of them. And now, that promise was real. Inside the cabin, Alona helped Nita unroll a small woven blanket they had brought with them. They placed their few belongings neatly in a corner. For the first time in a long time, they were not just passing through. They had a roof over their heads, walls around them, and a man who seemed quiet but steady. That evening, Eli cooked beans on the small stove. The smell filled the cabin. He set 3 plates on the table. Alona and Nita sat down carefully, unsure of what to do. Eli poured water into 3 cups and handed them each a plate. They looked surprised that he served them first before himself. Alona whispered something softly to Nita in their language. Eli didn't understand the words, but he recognized the feeling. It was the soft sound of a sister trying to make the other feel safe. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the creaking of the wooden chairs, the soft clink of spoons, and the quiet breathing of 3 people who didn't yet know each other's words, but were slowly learning each other's presence. After supper, Eli stepped outside to watch the sunset. The sky turned gold and then deep orange. The sisters came out a few minutes later. Alona sat on the porch step. Nita stood beside her, her hands wrapped in her shawl. Eli leaned on the porch post. They didn't speak, but they shared the same view: the open plains, the fading light, and the soft wind that brushed against their faces. In that silence, something small but real grew between them. It wasn't friendship yet, and it wasn't love. It was something simpler, a quiet understanding that they were now part of the same story. That night, Eli gave them his bed and slept on a pile of blankets near the fire. He didn't tell them why. He didn't need to. They saw it. They understood that he was giving them a sense of safety and respect. Lying on the floor, Eli stared at the wooden ceiling, listening to the wind outside. His life had changed in a single day. Just a few hours ago, this cabin had been silent, just the crackling fire and the lonely sound of coyotes in the distance. Now there were two quiet voices whispering in the dark, two gentle breaths where there had been none. In the morning, he would rise before the sun like always. He would fix the fence, feed the horse, and work the herd. But now, when he returned at dusk, the cabin would no longer be empty. The next day, they began to find a rhythm without even planning it. Eli worked outside, Alona cleaned the cabin and started learning where everything belonged. Nita stayed close to her sister, helping as best she could. She was shy, but she watched. Eli carefully, slowly realizing that he wasn't a loud man. He wasn't like the men they had seen before. His silence made the air around them calm. In the afternoons, they watched him work the herd. The horse moved steady under him, and the cattle followed his quiet commands. He never shouted. He never showed impatience. It made the sisters feel safe. Eli began learning their faces, their small expressions. Alona's calm eyes always searched for understanding, while Nita's big, curious eyes tried to take in everything. Sometimes, he caught Nita smiling softly at the animals near the fence. It was the first sign of lightness he saw in her. When he walked into the cabin at sunset, the smell of warm bread filled the air. They had baked something from the small bag of flour. It was uneven and a little burnt on the edges, but it tasted better than anything he had eaten in months. He didn't say it out loud, but the way his shoulders relaxed told them everything. That evening, as the stars filled the sky, Alona whispered a few words in English. "Safe," she said slowly, pointing at the cabin. Her voice was quiet but clear. Eli nodded, a small, honest smile appearing at the corner of his mouth. "Yes, safe," he repeated. It was only one word, but it was enough. That night, when the wind blew softly through the cracks of the cabin walls, Eli closed his eyes and listened again. It was no longer a lonely house. It was slowly becoming a home. And it all started with a deal made with $12 and a quiet promise. A promise he intended to keep. The days passed slowly, like soft wind rolling over the open plains. Every sunrise brought a new rhythm to the small ranch. Eli woke before the light touched the land, just as he always had, but now when he stepped outside, he could hear small movements inside the cabin, the rustle of cloth, the soft sound of water being poured, the quiet whispers of Alona and Nita talking in their language. It no longer felt like he was the only living soul out here. The sisters were shy at first, moving through the cabin like they were walking on delicate glass. But as each day stretched into another, they began to breathe more freely. Alona, the older sister, was the first to step forward and quietly find her place. She began tending the fire every morning before Eli came back from the barn. Nita helped her sweep the floor, clean the table, and boil water. They didn't talk much to Eli, but small actions replaced words. Eli worked from sunrise to sunset. His life was made of hard chores: mending fences, herding cattle, gathering water from the creek, repairing the barn walls that had begun to lean from years of storms. But now, when he returned from the field, tired and covered in dust, there was something waiting for him: a warm meal, soft light from the fire, and two pairs of eyes watching quietly, learning him the same way he was learning them. Communication was slow, like the steady trickle of water down the creek. They didn't share a language, but they began to build one of their own. Eli pointed at objects and said their names softly. "Table," he would say, touching it. Alona would repeat the sound carefully. "Table." Nita would follow with a giggle at her own mispronunciation, then try again until Eli nodded in approval. Then Alona would say the Apache word back to him, slow and patient. He repeated it clumsily. She would laugh softly, not to make fun of him, but because it was the first warm sound she had made in a long time. At night, under the same roof, the cabin felt like a quiet classroom. A hand gesture, a look, a short word, and slowly a bridge began to form between them. But life on the frontier wasn't easy. One morning, a cold wind swept across the plain earlier than usual, a sign that summer was ending. That meant long nights, harder work, and more preparation. Eli needed to build more shelter for the cattle, chop firewood, and store enough supplies for winter. Alone, it would have taken him weeks, but he wasn't alone anymore. Without being asked, Alona began to help. She carried wood from the pile near the barn, her steps steady and sure. Nita followed with smaller pieces, smiling each time Eli nodded at her. They weren't just guests anymore. They were part of the work, and on the frontier, work was how trust was built. One afternoon, Eli was repairing a broken fence when he heard a soft humming. It was Alona, standing near the water trough, singing a quiet tune in her native language while Nita braided strands of grass near her feet. The sound was gentle, almost like the wind. Eli didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling. It was the sound of people who were beginning to feel safe. Eli started teaching them about ranch work in his own quiet way. He showed Alona how to lead the horse to the well without pulling too hard. She watched carefully and copied his movements. She learned fast. Nita followed the chickens, making faces at them as they pecked around the yard, her laugh echoing against the barn walls. It was the first time the ranch had heard laughter in many years. One warm evening, they all sat outside as the sun went down. Eli leaned on the porch rail, while Alona and Nita sat on the steps. The sky was painted orange and pink, the kind of sunset that could make even the toughest cowboy stop and stare. Alona picked up a small stick and drew shapes in the dirt. She pointed at a drawing of a house and then at the cabin. Then she drew a small sun above it and smiled softly. Eli understood without words. This place was starting to feel like home to them, too. Still, not everything was easy. The language gap sometimes caused small misunderstandings. One morning, Eli was trying to explain that the barn door needed to be closed at night to keep the coyotes away. Alona thought he was asking her to keep the windows closed in the cabin. She shut them tightly and the cabin turned hot as an oven. When Eli came back and laughed gently, Alona realized the mistake and laughed too. Nita joined in, holding her stomach from giggling. It wasn't a fight. It was a moment that made them feel more like a real family. As the weeks passed, Alona began taking responsibility for the household in a quiet, natural way. She made sure the water pot was always full. The table was clean and the small herb patch by the fence began to grow again. Nita was more playful. She followed Eli around the ranch like a curious shadow, asking questions with her eyes. She loved the horse, brushing its mane carefully every afternoon, whispering little songs to it. Eli wasn't used to people watching him work. For years, he'd done everything alone, but he began to notice how their presence changed the way the ranch felt. When he came back from the far field, instead of silence, he'd see smoke rising from the chimney and two figures waiting on the porch. It wasn't loud or grand, but it was enough to make him feel like he belonged to something bigger than himself. One day, while fixing the water pump, Eli's hand slipped and he scraped his knuckles badly on the metal. He didn't make a sound, but Alona saw it. She hurried over with a clean cloth. She didn't speak, but her hands were steady as she wrapped the cloth around his hand. Her eyes said what words couldn't. "You're not alone anymore." As the sun set that evening, they sat together on the porch again, the sky glowing red. Nita rested her chin on her knees, watching the horizon. Alona sat quietly, sewing a tear in one of Eli's shirts. Eli leaned back, his hand still bandaged, and felt something he hadn't felt in years, a soft, deep calm. The neighbors in town had started to notice the change. When Eli came in for supplies, people talked quietly about how the once silent cowboy now had smoke rising from his chimney every night, how two Apache sisters had built a new rhythm on that quiet piece of land. Some were curious, some doubtful, and a few even jealous. But Eli didn't care what they said. He wasn't a man who lived for other people's opinions. The real world outside their little ranch was not always kind, but inside those few acres of open plain, they were slowly building something steady. They shared chores, small smiles, and wordless conversations that meant more than long speeches. As autumn deepened, they faced their first big challenge together. A herd of cattle pushed through a weak fence and wandered toward the creek. It could have been a disaster if they lost them. But Alona was the one who spotted it first. She ran to Eli, pointed toward the creek, and shouted one clear English word she had learned. "Cows!" Eli grabbed his hat, jumped on his horse, and rode hard to the creek. What he didn't expect was Alona and Nita following him. Nita carried a rope, and Alona picked up a long stick to guide the herd. Eli wanted to tell them to stay back, but they were already moving with him. Together they worked as if they had been doing it for years. Alona moved quietly, waving the stick just enough to turn the cattle. Nita ran along the edge, shouting to keep them in line. Eli rode at the front, guiding them back toward the fence. By the time the sun dipped low, The herd was safe inside the corral again. They were all covered in dust, breathing hard but smiling. Eli looked at them, at the two sisters who had once been strangers, and felt something strong settle inside him. That night they laughed for the first time around the fire. Real laughter. It wasn't loud, but it was full. Nita teased Eli by pointing at the fence and saying, "Cow! Cow," with a wide grin. Alona tried to copy his serious cowboy face, and he couldn't help but smile back. The bond that had started as a quiet promise was now becoming real. They were no longer three separate lives. They were beginning to move like one team. Eli didn't say it out loud, but as he looked at the two sisters by the fire that night, he knew this wasn't just a house anymore. This was the beginning of a family. A family built on trust, work, quiet smiles, and shared sunsets. And somewhere in the stillness of the night, while coyotes howled far in the distance, Eli understood something clearly. This was no longer just about $12. It was about everything they were building together, one day at a time. The first cold wind of the season came early that year. It started with a soft breeze in the morning, but by evening the clouds gathered heavy and gray above the open plains. The horses moved nervously in the corral and the cattle huddled together near the fence. Eli knew that kind of wind. It meant a storm was coming, not just rain, but a hard one. He stood on the porch with his arms crossed, watching the sky turn darker by the minute. Alona came out quietly, wrapping a shawl tightly around her shoulders. She followed his eyes to the dark horizon. She didn't need to understand every word he might have said. She could see the worry on his face. Nita peeked through the cabin door, holding a small lantern, her big eyes shining in the dim light. "Storm," Eli said simply, pointing at the sky. Alona nodded slowly. She might not have known many English words, but this one she understood. Storms on the frontier were no small thing. They came fast, they came hard, and they tested everything you had built. Eli moved quickly. He tightened the ropes on the barn door, checked the fences, and made sure the tools were tied down. The wind had started to push harder now, whistling through the tall grass. The sisters followed him without hesitation. Alona grabbed the bucket and started helping him secure the water barrels. Nita gathered the small animals and moved them closer to the cabin. For the first time, they were not just helping. They were moving with purpose, like they were part of the ranch. By the time the first cold drops of rain hit the dirt, they were all working side by side. The wind roared through the valley like a wild beast. The cattle lowed loudly, stamping their hooves. Eli ran to the fence to keep it from giving way, and Alona followed him with a rope. Nita held the lantern near the barn door, shielding it from the rain. Then the sky opened up. Heavy rain poured down, soaking everything within minutes. Eli's hat was dripping, his coat clinging to his back. But he didn't stop. He could see one corner of the fence shaking loose. If it fell, the cattle would run and they might not get them back. He rushed toward it. Alona, without a word, grabbed the other end of the rope and followed. Nita called out something in Apache, her voice trembling but brave. The fence creaked under the weight of the wind. Eli wrapped the rope around a post, pulling with all his strength. Alona braced her feet in the mud and pulled beside him. The rain hit their faces like cold stones, but they didn't let go. It wasn't just Eli's ranch anymore. It was their home too. Minutes felt like hours. The storm showed no mercy. A flash of lightning lit up the plain, followed by a loud crack of thunder that shook the ground. Nita screamed softly but didn't run. She held the lantern high, her small hands shaking, giving Eli and Alona the only light they had. At one point, the wind nearly threw Eli off balance. Alona caught his arm, steadying him. Their eyes met for a split second in the storm. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. They were in this together. Finally, after what felt like forever, Eli managed to tie the last knot, securing the fence. The cattle stayed in place, pressed together, trembling but safe. Soaked to the bone, Eli and Alona stumbled back toward the barn. The mud clung to their boots. Nita ran ahead, opening the barn door just enough to let them in before pushing it shut against the wind. Inside, the horses stamped their hooves nervously. Eli went straight to calming them down, running his hands down their necks, whispering softly. Alona helped cover the feed with a tarp so it wouldn't get wet. Nita stood near the door, peeking outside at the raging storm. The three of them worked together in the warm, musty air of the barn, with rain pounding the roof above. Their breaths came out in puffs of fog, but in that moment none of them felt alone. They weren't strangers anymore. Hours passed before the storm finally began to weaken. The thunder grew distant and the rain softened into a steady drizzle. Eli pushed open the barn door carefully. The sky was dark, but the worst had passed. The fence still stood. The cattle were safe. The cabin, though soaked, was still standing. They walked back to the porch, dripping wet and covered in mud. The lantern in Nita's hand flickered softly. For a moment, the three of them just stood there, listening to the quiet after the storm. Then slowly, Alona began to laugh softly. It wasn't loud, it was a gentle, warm laugh of relief. Nita followed with a brighter, lighter laugh, and Eli, tired and soaked, couldn't help but smile. Back inside, they changed into dry clothes. Eli built a strong fire in the stove. The crackle and warmth filled the cabin. Alona handed him a small cloth to dry his hair, and Nita wrapped herself in a blanket, her cheeks still pink from the cold. For the first time, the cabin didn't feel like a place they lived in separately. It felt like one home shared. Alona cooked a simple meal with what they had left, while Eli sat near the fire, rubbing warmth back into his hands. Nita hummed softly to herself, rocking a small mug of warm water between her palms. When they sat together to eat, there was no silence this time. Alona said a few soft words in her language. Nita smiled at Eli shyly. Eli said, "Good work," pointing at both of them. They didn't need to know all the word. They understood what he meant. The storm had shaken the ranch, but it had also bound them together more tightly than anything else could. It was the first real test of their trust, and they had faced it as one. The following days were full of hard work. The storm had damaged parts of the fence and scattered loose wood. The three of them worked side by side, repairing everything. Alona tied the ropes while Eli hammered the nails. Nita gathered small branches to keep the fire going inside. When they finished, they stood together looking at what they had fixed. It wasn't just the fence they had rebuilt, it was their sense of belonging. That evening, the sky turned gold again, as if the storm had never happened. They sat on the porch wrapped in warm blankets, watching the sunset. Alona leaned her head slightly back, closing her eyes to feel the warm breeze. Nita rested her chin on her knees, watching the horses graze in the field. Eli leaned on the porch post, quiet as always, but inside him something was different. Before the storm, they were three people living together. After the storm, they were something closer. A team, a family, a bond stronger than words. As the days grew colder, they prepared for winter together. Alona learned how to chop wood carefully without hurting herself. Nita fed the chickens every morning, laughing when they followed her around like she was their leader. Eli showed them how to stack hay in the barn, how to fix leaks in the roof, and how to cover the windows with cloth when the wind grew too sharp. Little by little, Alona began to speak more English. She would point at things and repeat the words Eli said, sometimes with a serious face, sometimes with a shy smile. Nita learned faster. She had a playful way of repeating the words back to Eli, often making him laugh quietly when she mixed them up. One night, as they sat around the fire, Alona said something softly in English, halting but clear. "We help you," she said, pointing at herself and Nita, then at him. Eli looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "We help each other." That single sentence carried more weight than any long speech could. It wasn't about the $12 anymore. It wasn't even about the storm. It was about the way they had chosen to stand beside each other. Winter arrived slowly, wrapping the plains in cold silence. But their little ranch no longer felt like a lonely corner of the world. Inside the cabin, the fire burned strong, and laughter sometimes echoed against the wooden walls. Outside, the fence stood tall and strong, a quiet reminder of the night they held it together. For Eli, the storm had changed something deep inside him. He had once thought of himself as a man who lived alone and died alone. But that night, when the wind howled and the rain beat against the land, two women had stood beside him and pulled the rope with all their strength. And from that night on, he no longer saw Alona and Nita as people he had taken in. He saw them as people who stood with him, and that made all the difference. The first snow of winter came quietly. There was no warning storm, no heavy wind, just soft white flakes falling slowly from the gray sky, covering the ground like a clean blanket. Eli stood outside the cabin with his hands in his coat pockets, watching the snow settle over the fence, the barn roof, and the corral. The world seemed calm and silent, almost like it was holding its breath. Inside the cabin, the fire was glowing warmly in the stove. Alona was kneeling on the floor, carefully rolling dough on the wooden table. Nita sat nearby, wrapping herself in a thick shawl, her cheeks red from the cold. She was carving something small from a piece of wood, a habit she had picked up over the past few weeks. It was their way of passing time during the long, cold days when the fields slept under snow. The ranch had changed. It was no longer just Eli's land. It belonged to all three of them now. Every corner of it carried their shared efforts. The barn doors had been repaired by their hands together. The fences stood strong because they had tied them down side by side. Even the small garden by the porch, now hidden under snow, had once been Nita's favorite place to sit in the afternoon. Eli stepped inside, shaking snow from his boots. The cabin smelled like warm bread. Alona looked up from her work and gave him a quiet smile. Nita raised the wooden carving proudly, showing it to him. It was a little horse, rough around the edges but full of spirit. Eli chuckled softly, the sound warm and rare. "Good," he said simply. Nita beamed, proud of her creation. After eating breakfast together, Eli took his thick coat from the wall. He had to check on the cattle. Winter on the plains didn't forgive laziness. The cold could take animals quickly if you weren't ready. But before he could step out, Alona appeared beside him with her shawl already wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She didn't wait for him to ask. She just nodded and followed. Nita rushed to put on her boots and came skipping behind them. The snow crunched softly under their feet as they walked toward the barn. A soft fog rose from the cattle's breath as they stood huddled together, safe and warm inside the shelter they had built weeks ago. Eli checked their water trough while Alona brought fresh hay. Nita brushed the horse's mane gently, whispering to it like it was a friend. When they finished their chores, they didn't rush back inside. Instead, they stood outside the barn and watched the snow fall. The world felt quiet, like time itself had slowed down. For Eli, this silence wasn't the same heavy silence he used to live with. This was different. This was the kind of silence that felt full of life, of presence, of something warm and steady. That evening, they gathered near the fire. Alona had cooked a stew with beans and dried meat, the only kind of food that lasted through winter. Eli sat back in his chair, his legs stretched out toward the fire. Alona sat on the other side, sewing a tear in one of Nita's shawls. Nita sat on the floor, still carving little shapes out of wood. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't loud. But it felt like home. For the first time in many years, Eli didn't feel the weight of loneliness pressing on him. He looked around at the warm cabin, at the women who had once been strangers but now shared his home, and felt a quiet pride inside him. This was not something he had bought with $12. This was something they had all built together with their hands, their work, and their trust. Later that night, snow piled high outside the windows. The fire crackled softly. Nita dozed off near the stove, her carving still in her lap. Alona sat quietly, staring into the fire. Eli didn't say much, he never did. But when his eyes met hers, there was understanding there. They didn't need a lot of words. They both knew what they had built here. The months passed slowly. Winter was long and hard, but they faced it together. They took turns waking early to feed the cattle. When the snow was too thick, they helped each other clear the path to the barn. Eli taught Alona how to ride the horse, though she preferred walking. Nita learned to whistle to the chickens, and for some reason, they always followed her. And every evening, no matter how cold the wind was outside, the fire inside the cabin burned steady. When spring finally arrived, the snow melted into the earth and green began to return to the land. The first tiny flowers bloomed near the creek. The sky stretched bright and endless again. Eli saddled the horse and rode the fence line to make sure everything had survived the winter. As he rode back toward the cabin, he saw something that made him stop. Alona was outside, hanging laundry on a rope between two posts. Nita was sitting on the porch, brushing the horse and humming a song. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, and the sun glowed softly on the wooden walls. It looked like something out of a memory he didn't know he had. Something warm. Something right. When Eli dismounted and walked toward the house, Nita looked up and grinned. "Horse," she called out happily in her simple English. Alona shook her head with a smile and handed him a small cup of water. These little moments had become part of their days. So simple, yet so steady. The ranch began to grow stronger with them. The cattle grew healthy through the spring. The chickens multiplied. The small herb garden Nita and Alona had started began to bloom again, bringing soft colors to the dusty ground. They planted corn together for the first time. laughing when the wind tried to blow away the seeds. Eli had never heard this much laughter on the land before. The neighbors noticed the change, too. Some of them still whispered, but most began to greet Eli differently when they saw him in town. The man who had once been known as the quiet cowboy who lived alone was no longer alone. He came into town with a soft, steady smile now. Sometimes Alona or Nita came with him. Their presence changed the way people looked at him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the plains gold, they sat together on the porch. The air was warm, the grass smelled sweet, and the sound of cattle carried softly from the corral. Alona leaned her back against the post, letting her shawl fall loosely around her shoulders. Nita sat cross-legged, holding her little wooden horse in her hand. Eli sat beside them, hat tipped low, watching the horizon. Alona pointed at the land, the barn, the corral, the field, the sky. She turned to Eli and said slowly, carefully, "Home." Her voice wasn't unsure this time. She said it like she truly meant it. Eli turned his head to look at her. He didn't smile wide. He wasn't the kind of man who did that. But a soft warmth touched his face, and he nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "Home." Nita repeated the word, "home," and giggled, hugging her little wooden carving. They sat there until the last bit of sunlight disappeared behind the hills. No one rushed inside. They just sat together, listening to the soft night sounds. The ranch, once silent and empty, was now alive, not with noise but with presence. Months turned into years. The story of Eli and the two Apache sisters slowly became something people whispered about in town, not with judgment anymore, but with quiet respect. People said he gave them a home, but those who truly understood knew it wasn't one-sided. They gave him something just as big in return. A family, a reason to keep building, a reason to keep living. Eli grew older, but his hands stayed steady. Alona grew stronger, her quiet leadership becoming the heartbeat of the home. Nita grew taller, always carrying a new carving in her pocket and laughter on her lips. Together they turned a small, lonely ranch into a place that felt alive. On quiet evenings, when the wind was soft and the fields shimmered under the sunset, Eli often found himself remembering that day in the trading post. Just $12. That was all it had taken to change everything. But as he looked around, at the home they had built, at the laughter on the porch, at the strength that filled the air, he understood the truth. It was never about the money. It was about the promise. The quiet nod. The choice to open his door and let two strangers become part of his life. And it was about how those strangers gave him something even greater in return. Years later, people in town would say, he was a quiet man, but he built something strong. And they would be right. Because on a little ranch far out on the plains, a man, a woman, and her sister built a life, and not with gold, not with fancy words, but with trust, hard work, and shared sunsets, and that in the end was worth far more than $12.